Elizabeth Carter did not plan to ruin everything that night. She planned to stay quiet, to smile, to let her father beg. But when Nathaniel Whitmore looked across the dinner table at a man who had worked his hands to bone and blood and said those words, something inside Elizabeth snapped clean in two. She set down her glass, slowly, deliberately, and she looked America's most powerful landowner directly in the eyes. If you've ever had to fight for the people you love, stay until the very end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1816 came to Shenandoah County, Virginia, the way bad news always comes quietly and all at once. The corn had been thin since April. The well on the eastern field had gone bitter. And Thomas Carter, who had once stood 6 feet tall and commanded 40 acres with the confidence of a man who believed honest work would always be enough, now sat at the head of his own dinner table, looking smaller than Elizabeth had ever seen him. He had pressed his best coat. She had noticed that before she noticed anything else. The dark wool saved for funerals, and the county fair now buttoned across his chest with careful dignity. He had even combed his gray hair flat. He'd asked her twice that afternoon whether the candles were straight. "They're straight, Papa," she'd told him both times. He hadn't heard her either time. That was how frightened he was. The letter had arrived 3 weeks prior, delivered by a writer she didn't recognize, sealed with wax pressed with the letter W. Her father had read it, standing at the kitchen window, and then held it against his chest for a long moment before he spoke. "Nathaniel Whitmore wants to come to supper." Elizabeth had looked up from the accounts she was trying to balance. The Whitmore also making your toy. His people reached out through the land office. Her father set the letter on the table as carefully as a man setting down something fragile. "He's looking at properties in the county, considering some investments." She had stared at her father's face and understood everything he wasn't saying. Whitmore. The name sat on the county like weather. Nathaniel Whitmore owned more Virginia land than any man west of Richmond. Timber Tobacco River Rights Mill shares. If it produced wealth in this part of the state, Whitmore's name was somewhere in its history. People said he had doubled his inheritance before he was 30. People said he never smiled. People said he had once walked away from a deal worth $40,000 because the man across the table had poor manners. People said a great many things about Nathaniel Whitmore, and none of them were the kind of things that made a struggling farmer feel hopeful. But her father was a struggling farmer, and Nathaniel Whitmore had asked to come to supper. So they had cleaned the house, polished the silver they still owned. Elizabeth had made a proper table good linen, the china her mother had brought from Maryland before she died. She'd cooked a roast that cost more than they could afford, and told herself it was an investment. She was practical like that. Always had been. Whitmore arrived at 6:30. He came in a black carriage with brass fittings that looked profoundly wrong, parked in front of her father's modest farmhouse. 2 men rode alongside. He stepped out alone. Elizabeth watched from the parlor window. He was taller than she had expected. Dark-haired, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a coat that probably cost more than her father's horse. He paused outside the front door for a moment and looked at the house with an expression she couldn't quite name from this distance. Not contempt. Not exactly. Something flatter than that. Something worse. Indifference. Her father went to greet him personally, and Elizabeth watched the way Thomas Carter, her father, who had survived drought and debt and the death of his wife, straightened his spine and extended his hand with the careful dignity of a man trying very hard not to look desperate. Whitmore shook it briefly. He did not smile. "Y'all." Supper began pleasantly enough, in the way that things often begin pleasantly when one party has all the power and the other party knows it. Her father had invited the county minister, Reverend Aldous Price, and his wife Margaret, to fill the table and soften the occasion. The Prices were good people, warm, chatty, skilled at the particular art of keeping conversation moving through awkward silences. Margaret Price could find 5 minutes of agreeable discussion in a turnip, and Elizabeth was grateful for that. Nathaniel Whitmore, however, did not make himself easy to talk to. He answered questions with the minimum number of words required. He moved his fork as though the act of eating at this table was a small inconvenience he had graciously agreed to endure. When Reverend Price made a generous remark about the county's resilience after the difficult growing season, Whitmore nodded once and returned his attention to his glass. Elizabeth watched him. She had a habit of watching people. Her mother had called it her best quality and her worst one simultaneously. "You see too much," her mother used to say. "That's a dangerous gift for a woman." Elizabeth watched Nathaniel Whitmore and saw the careful blankness behind his eyes, the way he held himself apart from the table, even while sitting at it, the way he never once looked directly at her father, only at the house, the furnishings, the small, threadbare edges of a family that had once been comfortable and was now fighting to stay above water. He was cataloging them, she realized, the way a man catalogs a property he's considering buying, not people, assets. Her father told a story about the Eastern County Fair 3 years back when he'd won a prize for his tobacco crop. It was a good story. He told it well, and Reverend Price laughed, and even Margaret Price dabbed at her eyes because the ending was unexpectedly tender, something about her mother presenting him with the ribbon. Whitmore did not react. He lifted his glass and drank. Her father's voice slowed, lost its confidence, trailed off before the ending arrived. Elizabeth felt something tighten in her chest. "The roast is excellent, Miss Carter," Margaret Price said loyally. "Thank you, Mrs. Price." "Your mother's recipe?" "Yes, ma'am." Whitmore finally spoke. He set down his glass and looked across the table, not at Elizabeth, not at her father, but at the middle distance between them, as though he were addressing no one in particular. "The property on the eastern ridge," he said. "You've let the fence line go." Her father blinked. "I beg your pardon." "The fencing along the eastern boundary. It was in poor repair when I rode past this morning, several sections down entirely. We've had a difficult season. Most operations with good management don't allow maintenance to deteriorate regardless of season." Whitmore picked up his fork again. "It's a question of priority." Silence settled over the table. Reverend Price cleared his throat carefully. Her father opened his mouth and then closed it. Elizabeth could see the precise moment when Thomas Carter's pride lost its brief, painful battle with the knowledge that he needed this man's good opinion. She watched her father nod slowly. "You're right, sir. We've been stretched thin." Whitmore made a small sound that wasn't agreement or sympathy. It was the sound of a man acknowledging a fact that did not particularly interest him. Elizabeth set down her knife, not loudly, not dramatically. She simply set it down and folded her hands in her lap and breathed once through her nose. Keep quiet, she told herself. She told herself this 3 more times over the following 10 minutes, while Whitmore ate in near silence, and her father tried 3 more times to revive some version of conversation, each attempt landing flatter than the last. The Reverend and his wife were doing their best. God bless them. But the table had a gravity to it now, pulling everything toward that careful, expensive silence at the other end. Then Nathaniel Whitmore looked up from his plate. He looked around the dining room at the wallpaper her mother had chosen 20 years ago, and that Elizabeth had carefully repaired in 2 corners with clothes-matched paper, and a prayer nobody would notice. At the silver candlesticks her father had refused to sell, even when things were darkest. At the hand-stitched tablecloth that had taken her 3 weeks to complete after she found the original worn through at both ends. He looked at all of this, and then he said in the casual offhand tone of a man stating something obvious, "I suppose people in circumstances like these simply lack the initiative to improve their situation. It's a peculiar kind of comfort, I think, the habit of settling." The room stopped. Even the candle flames seemed to freeze. Reverend Price set down his fork with a small click that sounded enormous in the silence. Margaret Price looked at her plate. Her father, who had pressed his best coat and combed his hair and cooked the best meal the farm could provide and told his stories and swallowed his dignity and done everything a good man does when he is trying to save his family. Her father lowered his eyes to the tablecloth. He didn't say a word. He just lowered his eyes. And that was the moment Elizabeth Carter stopped keeping quiet. Judd. She didn't raise her voice. That was the thing people remembered afterward, the ones who had been there. They always mentioned it. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She spoke in the same tone she used when she was reading aloud to her father in the evenings, clear, unhurried, precise. Mr. Whitmore. He looked at her. For the first time all evening, he looked directly at her. This man, she said, and she gestured toward her father with the slight tilt of her head that her mother used to call her only aristocratic quality, worked this land for 31 years. He raised 3 children on it after his wife died. He paid his debts honestly when half the county was defaulting. He has not settled. He has endured. And there is a considerable difference, sir, between a man who lacks initiative and a man who has simply run out of luck. Nobody breathed. Whitmore's expression did not change. That was the frightening part. He looked at her with those flat, dark eyes, and he did not look surprised or offended, or even particularly interested. He just looked at her. Elizabeth held his gaze and continued. You came to this house tonight as his guest. You ate his food and sat at his table and accepted the hospitality of a man who was clearly hoping to earn your respect. And instead of respect, you have offered him a lecture on character delivered in his own home in front of his daughter and his minister. She paused. I wonder, sir, what word you would use for that kind of behavior. Because where I come from, we have a word for a man who uses his position to make smaller men feel ashamed. And it is not initiative. The silence after that was a different kind of silence. Nathaniel Whitmore put down his fork. He looked at her for a long moment. A measuring look, but different now, not the cataloging assessment he'd been doing all evening. Something more focused. Something that might in a different man's face have been the beginning of surprise. You have a great deal to say for yourself, Miss Carter, he said finally. His voice was perfectly even. I generally find that someone has to, she replied. But you were. He left within the hour. Not angrily, she would have felt better, she thought, if he'd left angrily. Anger would have meant she'd reached something. Instead, he thanked her father for supper with perfect formal courtesy, shook hands again with the Reverend, gave Elizabeth one last unreadable look, and walked out into the summer night to his carriage. The sound of wheels on the drive was the loneliest sound Elizabeth had heard in a long time. Reverend Price cleared his throat and said something kind and meaningless. His wife pressed Elizabeth's hand on the way out. Then they were gone too, and Elizabeth was alone with her father in the ruins of what was supposed to have been a salvaging dinner. Thomas Carter sat at the head of his table for a long moment without speaking. Elizabeth started clearing plates. Lizzie? His voice was quiet. Yes, Papa. What have you done? She stopped moving, set a plate back on the table, and stood with her hands flat against the linen. I couldn't let him say that to you. He was our best chance. Her father's voice cracked on the last word just slightly, just enough. Do you understand that he was the only man in this county with enough money to make the difference? And you told him? He stopped, pressed his hand over his eyes. Lord Almighty, Lizzie. I know. What do you know? You know that we owe Carpenter's Bank a note due in November. You know that the East Field produced a third of last year's yield. Do you know those things? Yes, I keep the accounts, Papa. I know exactly what we owe. Then how could you? Because he made you lower your eyes. Her voice came out fiercer than she intended. She pressed her lips together and tried again, quieter. He sat at your table and made you lower your eyes, and I couldn't sit there and watch that happen. I'm sorry. I know what it costs. I'm sorry. Her father was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very softly, Your mother would have done the same thing. Elizabeth didn't say anything. She picked up the plate again and walked to the kitchen, and she stood at the wash basin for a full minute before she trusted herself to start working. She lay awake that night going over the math. This was what she did when she was frightened. She ran numbers. The note at Carpenter's Bank. The feed costs through winter. The repairs the barn roof needed before October. What they might get for the west pasture if they sold it by September. whether that would be enough. It wasn't enough. She already knew it wasn't enough. She had ruined their best chance at enough, and she had known exactly what she was doing, and she would do it again, and she hated herself for all three of those things simultaneously. The night was warm. Summer in Virginia sat on a person like a second wool coat, and she lay on top of her bedclothes and stared at the ceiling and listened to the crickets outside her window and tried to think clearly. Maybe Whitmore would forget the whole business. Move on to another property, another county. Maybe it would be a clean wound, they would lose his interest, but they wouldn't gain anything new to fear. Maybe. She was still trying to make herself believe maybe when she heard gravel on the drive. She sat up. She heard her father's voice from downstairs, brief, surprised. Then another voice lower and more measured that she recognized. Elizabeth got up and put on her wrapper and walked to the top of the stairs. Nathaniel Whitmore was standing in her father's front hall. He still wore his coat. His hat was in his hand. He looked different from this angle, or perhaps just different now that she wasn't watching him from across a table. He looked, she thought, like a man who had made a decision and wasn't entirely sure it was the right one. He looked up. He saw her on the stairs. "Miss Carter," he said. She held the banister. "Mr. Whitmore?" "I owe your father an apology," he said. "That is why I came back." She came down the stairs slowly, not because she was unsure of her footing, because she was thinking, and she always moved more carefully when she was thinking hard. "It's 9:30, she said. "Most men don't return to make apologies at 9:30. Most men should." He held her gaze steadily. "I spoke with disrespect in another man's home. I have been thinking about it since I left. It is not the kind of man I intend to be." She studied him. This was not what she had expected. She had expected repercussions, perhaps, some formal coldness, a polite withdrawal from any consideration of Carter land. She had not expected Nathaniel Whitmore standing in her father's hall at 9:30 with his hat in his hands, saying he had been thinking about it. "That," she said carefully, "is an unusual thing to say. I'm told an unusual man." Something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile. It was more like the memory of a smile briefly visible. Usually people mean it as a criticism. Her father had come out of the sitting room and stood in the hallway with the expression of a man watching something he didn't entirely understand. Whitmore turned to him. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I behaved badly at your table tonight. I have no excuse worth offering you. I can only tell you that I am aware of it and that it will not happen again." Thomas Carter blinked. Then he said, "Well, I appreciate a man who can admit to a thing." "Can I offer you coffee, Mr. Whitmore?" Elizabeth asked. She heard herself asking it and thought, "What are you doing?" And then thought, exactly what needs to be done. "I won't impose further tonight," Whitmore said. "I wanted only to say what needed to be said." He put his hat back on. "I'll be in the county for another week. If you're willing, Mr. Carter, I'd like to see the property properly, on its own terms." Her father's voice when he answered had something in it that it hadn't had all evening. Hope. "I'd be honored, sir." Whitmore nodded. He looked at Elizabeth one more time with that measuring gaze, different now from either version she'd seen before. Not the flat cataloging look of supper, not the focused attention of the argument, but something quieter and harder to name. "Good night, Miss Carter," he said. "Good night, Mr. Whitmore," she replied. She watched him walk out to his waiting carriage. She watched the door close. She stood in her father's hall in her wrapper, with her feet bare on the floorboards, and listened to the carriage move away down the drive. Then she turned to find her father watching her. "Don't say anything," she said. "I wasn't going to say a single word," her father told her, and the ghost of a smile moved across his tired face. Not one word. Elizabeth looked at the closed door for another moment. "Go to bed, Papa," she said quietly. "We'll see what morning brings." She walked back up the stairs in the warm summer dark, and she thought about a man who had come back when he didn't have to, and said what he didn't have to say, and looked at her like she was for the first time in a very long time someone worth looking at carefully. She lay down again on her bedclothes. She stared at the ceiling. She was not thinking about the banknote anymore. He came back the next morning before the dew had dried off the grass. Elizabeth heard the horse first. She was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled past her elbows, working through the breakfast dishes, and trying to convince herself that last night had meant nothing in particular, that a man returning to apologize was simply a man with good manners, nothing more, and she ought not to read anything into it that wasn't there. Then she heard the horse, and she dried her hands on her apron, and she looked out the kitchen window, and there he was. Nathaniel Whitmore rode alone this time. No carriage, no outriders. Just a dark horse, and a man who sat a saddle like he'd been born in one, coming up the drive at an easy walk, like he had every right in the world to be there at 7 in the morning. She untied her apron. Her father was already at the door by the time she reached the front hall. Thomas Carter had the look of a man who had slept better than he had any right to given the events of the previous evening, and who had decided somewhere between midnight and dawn to be cautiously optimistic about the morning. "Mr. Whitmore," he called from the doorway, "you're early." "I'm always early," Whitmore said, dismounting. "It's a failing, I'm told." He tied his horse at the post and came up the porch steps and stopped when he saw Elizabeth standing behind her father. He nodded to her, just once. She nodded back. "I thought we might walk the east field this morning if you're willing," Whitmore said to her father. "Before the heat sets in." "I'd like that," her father said. He turned to Elizabeth with the look he used when he wanted something and wasn't sure how to ask for it. She understood immediately. "I'll come along," she said. "I know the east field better than Papa does. I've been managing it since March." Something moved behind Whitmore's eyes, briefly. She couldn't name it. "Then by all means," he said. The east field was the worst of it, and Elizabeth knew it, and she had spent 3 months trying to fix what the bad winter and the thin spring had done to it. She knew every problem by heart. She had mapped them in the account book she kept on the kitchen shelf, the drainage issue in the lower quarter, the soil that had gone sour along the creek line, the section where the fencing had come down in February, and deer had gotten through twice before they'd managed to repair it. She told Whitmore all of this as they walked. Not defensively, not with apology. She told it to him the way she told things she knew thoroughly, directly, in order without decoration. "Here is what happened. Here is what I did about it. Here is what still needs doing, and why." Whitmore walked beside her and listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice over the top of her explanation. He listened the way Elizabeth had noticed very few men listened, like the words actually mattered, like he was filing them away somewhere useful rather than waiting for his turn to speak. Her father walked slightly behind them, quiet and watchful. When she finished, Whitmore said, "The drainage problem in the lower quarter. Have you considered a cut channel along the north side rather than trying to amend the soil?" She stopped walking, looked at him. "That would mean losing about 8 feet of plantable ground along that edge," she said. "Yes, but the water is going to keep doing what water does, and fighting it costs more than yielding to it." He looked at the field, not at her. "Sometimes the land tells you what it needs, if you're willing to hear it." She considered this. "That's not bad advice," she said finally. "I'm occasionally capable of it," he said. She looked at him. He wasn't smiling exactly, but there was something in the line of his mouth, a slight easing. The smallest suggestion that somewhere underneath all that careful blankness, there might be a man who was capable of being dry about himself. She filed that away. They walked for an hour and a half. By the time they came back to the house, something had shifted in the air between the three of them, though Elizabeth would have struggled to say precisely what. Her father's shoulders were higher. He was talking more freely, telling Whitmore about the tobacco operation, the mill shares he'd had a piece of years back, his opinions on the county land office. Whitmore asked questions that were smart without being condescending. He had clearly spent years learning how to assess land and the people who worked it, and it showed. But twice more Elizabeth noticed him listening to her specifically. Not to her father, to her. When she mentioned the note at Carpenter's bank, she wasn't even addressing him directly, She was explaining something to her father, and Whitmore went still, in a way she felt more than saw. Not ostentatious stillness, just a slight pause, like a man noting a coordinate. She decided to ignore it for now. They had coffee on the porch. Her father and Whitmore talked figures and acreage. Elizabeth sat slightly apart and listened, and said nothing, and noticed everything, because that was what she did. When Whitmore stood to leave, he looked at her father. "I'll have my man draw up a preliminary discussion of terms," he said. "Nothing binding, just a starting point." Her father's voice was very steady when he answered. "I appreciate that, sir." Whitmore put on his hat. He looked at Elizabeth. "Miss Carter," he said. "The channel idea, think about it." "I already have," she said. One brief pause. Then he walked to his horse and rode back down the drive the way he'd come. Her father waited until the horse was out of sight. Then he sat back down in his porch chair heavily and put his face in his hands and breathed. "Papa." "I'm all right." His voice was muffled. "I'm perfectly all right. Just give me a moment." She gave him the moment. "He's going to help us," her father said, lifting his face. His eyes were wet. "I can feel it, Lizzie. I think he's actually going to help us." Elizabeth looked down the empty drive. "Maybe," she said carefully, but she thought yes. The terms came 4 days later. Her father spread them on the kitchen table and called Elizabeth in, and they sat together for 2 hours, going through the language word by word. Elizabeth had taught herself contract reading the same way she'd taught herself account keeping out of necessity, without formal instruction, with a dictionary on one side and stubbornness on the other. No. The terms were fair. More than fair, honestly. Whitmore proposed a partial investment in the Eastfield drainage project structured as a loan against future crop yield rather than a lien on the land itself. The interest was modest. The repayment schedule was reasonable. There were no hidden conditions in the language, no clauses designed to compound debt, no mechanisms she recognized as designed to turn a man's gratitude into a trap. "It's clean," she told her father. "It's genuinely clean. Then we accept," he said. She nodded. But she had one more thing to check. She wrote a letter that afternoon not to Whitmore himself, but to the county land office, asking for the public record on Whitmore's previous investment arrangements. She wasn't suspicious. She was careful. There was a difference, and she had been careful her whole life, because careful was what kept a family from drowning slowly. The record came back within the week. 3 prior arrangements in the county, all completed, all settled at terms matching or favorable to the borrowing party. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the account book and thought about what kind of man goes to the trouble of being quietly fair when he doesn't have to be. He came back that Thursday. Not for business this time, or not only for business. He brought the signed copy of the preliminary terms, which took approximately 4 minutes to deliver, and then he stayed for another 2 hours. He asked to see the kitchen garden. Elizabeth didn't know quite what to make of this, but she walked him through it, the herbs she'd put in along the south wall, the beans she'd been nurturing through the dry spell, the spot where she'd tried watermelons for the first time on a theory about the soil drainage. "The watermelons are ambitious," Whitmore said. "I like ambitious plans," she told him. "Even when they fail, especially then. You learn more from a failed watermelon than a successful one." She paused. "That is possibly the most ridiculous sentence I have ever said aloud." He looked at her. And this time, it was not the memory of a smile. It was an actual smile, small and slightly startled, like it had arrived on his face before he'd had time to decide whether to allow it. It changed him entirely. She saw it the way a face can open just briefly when it forgets to be defended. He looked for just that moment like a man who might have been different once before something had taught him to close himself off. Like a man who still remembered what warmth felt like even if he'd stopped trusting it. The smile disappeared quickly. He looked away, but Elizabeth had seen it, and she didn't forget it. He started coming Thursdays. It was not officially a pattern. There was always a reason the progress on the drainage project. A question about the lease structure, a document requiring her father's signature. But the reasons got thinner as the summer got hotter, and the visit stayed just as long. And Elizabeth's father took to conveniently disappearing into the barn around the second hour. She didn't call her father on this because she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to. Nathaniel Whitmore, she was discovering, was nothing like what she had assumed. He was educated in the sharp, self-directed way of men who read voraciously rather than formally. History, agriculture, political theory, natural philosophy. He had opinions. When he forgot to be careful about having them, they came out precise and occasionally surprising. He had read Jefferson and disagreed with him on 3 specific points, which he could enumerate exactly. He thought the county's approach to road maintenance was economically indefensible. He had strong views about crop rotation that he'd apparently arrived at through trial and error over 7 years of managing land he'd inherited too young. She found all of this interesting. She also found, and this was less comfortable to admit, that he was interested in what she thought. Not politely, not in the way men sometimes performed interest in a woman's opinions, while clearly waiting for the conversation to move to something they considered more important. He asked questions, and then listened to the answers, and then asked follow-up questions that proved he had actually heard the first answer. That was in Elizabeth Carter's experience rarer than it ought to be. One Thursday afternoon, about 3 weeks in, they were sitting on the porch, arguing about the county's water rights ordinance. Elizabeth thought it was badly drafted, and said so with some force when she heard a horse on the road and looked up to find Caroline Harrington riding past. Caroline didn't stop, but she slowed. She looked at the porch, at Whitmore, at Elizabeth. She looked for long enough to make it clear she intended to be seen looking. Then she moved on. Elizabeth looked back at Whitmore. He had gone slightly still. "Old acquaintance?" Elizabeth asked. "Old expectation," he said. She waited to see if he would say more. He didn't. He picked up the thread of the water rights conversation, as though the interruption hadn't happened, and Elizabeth let him, because she understood the particular skill of not pressing on a sore place, until you knew how deep it went. But she filed it away. Caroline Harrington, daughter of the county's second wealthiest family, unmarried, possessed of the particular kind of elegance that came not from grace, but from long practice and considerable expenditure. Elizabeth had met her twice at county functions and found her thoroughly formidable and almost entirely without warmth. She filed all of this away and thought about it later alone, and came to no comfortable conclusions. 2 weeks after Caroline Harrington rode past the porch, she arrived at the Carter farm directly, in a carriage this time, accompanied by her mother, Mrs. Dorothea Harrington, a woman whose social authority was so well established that she could use it without ever raising her voice. They called it a friendly visit. Brought a jar of preserved peaches and a smile that could have been made of the same material as the jar. Elizabeth received them in the front parlor because her father was in the field, and the housekeeper was her, and she understood immediately and completely that this was not a friendly visit. "We understand Mr. Whitmore has been spending some time at your property," Mrs. Harrington said within 4 minutes of sitting down. "He has business interests in the county," Elizabeth said. "Of course." Mrs. Harrington smiled. "He is a very engaged businessman. We've known Nathaniel since he was a boy, you know. The families have been close for many years." A pause. The precise weight of a pause. "Caroline and he have a particular understanding." Elizabeth kept her expression pleasant and her hands still in her lap. "I wasn't aware of that," she said. "It's not formalized," Caroline said from the settee. She was looking at Elizabeth with an appraisal that was several degrees cooler than her mother's. "But there are expectations. In these matters, expectations count for a great deal. Don't you think so, Miss Carter?" "I think expectations can be a poor substitute for honest conversation," Elizabeth said. Caroline's eyes went sharp. "You are very direct," she said. "Not quite a compliment. I find it saves time." Elizabeth said. Not quite an apology. Mrs. Harrington set down her teacup. She leaned forward with the gentle, implacable manner of a woman who had won a great many drawing-room battles and knew exactly how she did it. "My dear girl," she said, and her voice was kind the way February is kind, cold through and through but sincere in its nature. "Nathaniel Whitmore is not a man who is free to follow a passing curiosity. His obligations, his standing, the expectations of his family and his position, these are not small things. I say this to you without any unkindness, only because it seems someone ought to." Elizabeth looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Harrington," she said, "I appreciate your honesty, and I'll return it in kind. Mr. Whitmore comes to this farm on his own initiative, and stays on his own initiative. I have done nothing to pursue his company. If you have concerns about his intentions, I suggest you raise them with him directly." A long silence. "Well," Mrs. Harrington said. "Well," said Caroline. She stood. Her face was composed, but her eyes told a different story. A story about a woman who had expected this to go differently and was revising her estimation of Elizabeth Carter in real time. Not downward, Elizabeth thought. Just differently. They left within another 10 minutes. The preserved peaches stayed on the parlor table. Elizabeth looked at them for a moment. Then she picked them up and put them in the kitchen, because waste was waste, regardless of the intentions of the giver, and she had been raised practical. She didn't tell Whitmore about the visit. She told herself this was because it wasn't her business to manage his social entanglements, which was true. She also told herself it was because bringing it up would require explaining why it had unsettled her, which would require examining why it had unsettled her, which was a line of inquiry she was not presently prepared to follow to its conclusion. She was 24 years old and had spent the last 3 years running her father's accounts and watching the farm slowly find its footing after years of barely staying upright. She had not been thinking about marriage. She had not been thinking about much beyond November and the banknote. She was not, she told herself firmly, beginning to think about it now. What she was thinking about, what she kept coming back to in spite of herself, was that Thursday afternoon question, the one she hadn't asked yet. What had happened to him? Because something had. She was as certain of this as she had ever been certain of anything. The blankness she'd seen that first night wasn't natural to him. She'd understood that slowly across weeks of Thursday afternoons. It was built, constructed carefully over something that had once been different. The man who'd looked startled by his own smile had not always held it back. The man who listened so carefully to what she said had not always believed words were dangerous. Something had taught him those things. She wondered what. She found out on the last Thursday in August. It happened because of the heat which had built all week into something mean and pressing, and because her father had a headache and had gone to lie down, and because the lemonade she brought out to the porch was not as cold as it might have been. These small things. The small things that shift the angle of an afternoon. They were talking about the creek. The water level had dropped. Another consequence of the dry summer, and Whitmore said something about the spring floods in the western counties, and then he stopped. He looked at the railing. "My brother drowned in a river," he said, 4 years ago. Elizabeth went very still. "Samuel," Whitmore said. He was 22. He said the name like it cost him something. He wanted to run a trade route through the Western Territories. I thought it was foolish. We argued about it. I told him. He stopped. His jaw worked briefly. I told him he was being reckless, and that I wouldn't help him finance it, and that if he went ahead without proper preparation, the consequences were his own to live with. The porch was quiet. A bird called somewhere in the far field. "He went anyway," Whitmore said. "He was Samuel. He always went anyway. He was always the one who went." A pause. The river took him 3 weeks later, a crossing in early spring when the melt was running high. They told me it was fast. That he wouldn't have that it was fast. Elizabeth did not move. She understood instinctively that this was not a moment for comfort or for words. This was a moment for being present and still, and letting him say the thing he had apparently been carrying for 4 years without anyone to say it to. "I never forgave him," Whitmore said quietly. "That was the last real conversation we had. I never took it back." He looked at his hands. "So I stopped," he said. "Stopped all of it. The openness. The faith that people could be trusted. He stopped, looked at her. His voice had gone flat in the way of a man quoting something he has told himself so many times. It has become rote. "I decided that if I never gave anyone room to hurt me again, no one could." It seemed like a sensible position. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. "That is not a sensible position," she said. "That is a prison you built yourself and decided to call a fortress." He stared at her. She held his gaze steady. "Your brother died, and instead of grieving him, you put yourself in solitary confinement. For 4 years you have been punishing yourself for a fight that hundreds of brothers have without anyone drowning. And in the meantime, you've become the kind of man who sits at other people's dinner tables and makes them feel small. Because a man who is in enough pain does not bother to be careful with people he's decided don't matter." His voice came out rough. "You're saying I became my grief." "I'm saying grief is not a character trait," she said. "It is a wound. And wounds that aren't tended don't close. They just get infected and teach the person carrying them to mistake the infection for their own personality." The silence after that was enormous. It had a weight and a texture and a particular quality of stillness that Elizabeth recognized not as emptiness, but as the moment after something necessary gets said out loud. The moment before a person decides what to do with the truth. Whitmore looked at her for a long time. Something moved behind his eyes. Not the flat blankness, not the careful measuring look. Something much older and much rawer than either of those things. "How do you do that?" he said finally. His voice was different, quieter, like something had been set down. "Do what?" "See directly through to the center of a thing." She considered this. "I learned young that the world tells you a great deal if you're willing to pay attention," she said. "Most people aren't. Paying attention requires believing that what you're looking at matters." She looked at him steadily. "You matter, Mr. Whitmore. Whatever conclusion you arrived at after Samuel died, that particular conclusion is wrong." He stood up from his chair. He walked to the porch railing and put both hands on it and stood with his back to her, looking out at the fields, and he stood like that for long enough that Elizabeth began to wonder if she'd gone too far, if she'd pressed when she shouldn't have, if she'd mistaken his willingness to talk for permission to dismantle. Then his shoulders came down, just slightly, just enough. "I don't know how to start," he said. "That's the honest answer. I have been this for 4 years, and I don't know what comes before it anymore." "You don't need to know what comes before it," Elizabeth said. "You just have to stop insisting on staying where you are." He turned around. He looked at her. Really looked the way he'd been doing since that first dinner, but now without the careful distance, without the measuring quality, without anything between what his eyes were doing and what they actually meant. Elizabeth felt something shift in the air between them, the way air shifts before weather. She thought, oh, she thought careful. She thought too late. "Miss Carter," he said. "Elizabeth." The first time he had used her given name. He said it like he was testing whether he was allowed to, and like he would accept the answer either way. "I find that I have become accustomed to Thursdays." "So have I," she said. A beat. "That is either very simple news," he said, "or very complicated news." "I expect it's both," she said. "Most true things are." He nodded. Once. Like a man accepting the terms of something he hadn't planned to agree to and wasn't sorry about. From somewhere inside the house, her father coughed loudly and unnecessarily. Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly. "He has been listening from the hallway since approximately the river conversation," she said. Whitmore made a sound that was without any question a genuine laugh. Short and startled and real, and it lit his face in a way that made him look about 10 years younger. "I'll speak to him," Whitmore said. "If that's, I'd like to speak to him." "Thursday," she said. You come every Thursday anyway." "I do," he agreed. He put his hat on. He walked down the porch steps. He stopped at the bottom and turned back. "Elizabeth," he said, "Samuel would have liked you enormously. He liked people who weren't afraid of the truth." She felt that land somewhere deep and stay there. "Go home, Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly. "Nathaniel," he said. She looked at him. "Nathaniel," she said. He nodded. He walked to his horse. He rode down the drive into the long gold light of the late August afternoon, and Elizabeth Carter stood on her father's porch and watched him go, and understood with the same clear certainty she brought to accounts and contracts, and the weight of a failing field, that something had begun. Whether it would be simple or complicated, or both, she couldn't say yet. She supposed she would find out on Thursday. Thursday came, and Nathaniel Whitmore did not come with it. Elizabeth told herself this was fine. Men had business. Men had obligations. A man who owned thousands of acres across 3 counties was not required to appear at a particular farm on a particular day simply because he had been doing so for 6 weeks running. She told herself this while she put the coffee on at the usual time, and then told herself she had put the coffee on because she wanted coffee, not because she was expecting company. Her father didn't say anything. He was wise enough for that. By noon, she had reorganized the kitchen shelf twice and recalculated the drainage project figures she already knew by heart and gone to look at the east field for no practical reason. By 2 o'clock, she was back at the kitchen table with the account book open in front of her and not a single number going in. The horse came up the drive at 3:30. But it wasn't Nathaniel Whitmore's horse. It was a rider she didn't recognize, young, maybe 17, wearing Whitmore livery. He handed her a folded note at the door and waited. She opened it. The handwriting was precise and slightly angular. The hand of a man who had learned penmanship from someone demanding and had never quite shaken the discipline of it. "Miss Carter, I apologize for the lateness of this notice. Business in Richmond required my departure this morning. I will return to the county by Saturday. If your father is agreeable, I would like to call Sunday afternoon. NWW." She read it twice. Then she looked at the rider. "Tell Mr. Whitmore Sunday is agreeable," she said. The boy tipped his hat and rode back the way he'd come. Elizabeth folded the note and put it in her apron pocket and went back to the account book. The numbers went in much more easily after that. She did not examine why. Sunday he arrived at 2 o'clock with a box of books under one arm and an expression she hadn't seen on him before, slightly careful, slightly braced, like a man walking into something he'd decided to do but hadn't fully accustomed himself to yet. "I thought," he said, holding the box out to her, "that you might find these useful. Agricultural texts mostly. One on water management in southern soils that I think directly addresses the drainage issue." She took the box, looked down at the titles, then looked up at him. "You brought me books," she said. "I did. About drainage. And soil chemistry. The third one is particularly thorough." A pause. "Nathaniel," she said, and she watched his face do the small, almost imperceptible thing it did when she used his name. A slight easing barely visible like a window opening half an inch in a room that had been closed too long. "You didn't need to bring me books to justify coming on Sunday." He looked at her steadily. "I'm aware of that." "All right then." "All right," he agreed. Her father appeared from the direction of the barn, saw the books said something warm and welcoming about agricultural science that everyone present understood was not about agricultural science, and suggested they sit on the porch because the afternoon was pleasant. They sat on the porch. And something was different. Not in a large, dramatic way. In the small, precise way that things change when a truth has been spoken out loud and cannot be unsaid, when two people have acknowledged something between them, and the acknowledgement has changed the air. He sat closer than he usually did. Not improper, just closer. and he looked at her differently, not with less guard exactly, but with the guard placed differently. The way a man might lower a fence on one side, because he's decided that side faces a neighbor rather than a threat. Elizabeth noticed all of this and said nothing about any of it and thought about it considerably. The first sign of real trouble came 4 days later. It came in the form of Reverend Price appearing at the kitchen door on a Wednesday morning with his hat in his hands and an expression that Elizabeth recognized immediately as the expression of a man delivering news he finds personally uncomfortable. "Lizzie," he said, "I think you ought to know. There's talk in town." She poured him coffee. "What kind of talk?" "The Harrington kind." He sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup. "Mrs. Harrington has been making calls, several of them, to families in the county, the Morrisons, the Dunbars, the Aldridges." He paused. "The general theme of the calls is that Mr. Whitmore's recent interest in the Carter property reflects a certain susceptibility in her word to a young woman of limited means and prospects who has positioned herself advantageously." Elizabeth set down the coffee pot very carefully. She said that. Her exact words, according to Margaret, were that it was a shame when a good man's grief made him vulnerable to opportunists. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "Opportunist," Elizabeth said. "I'm sorry, Lizzie." She breathed once through her nose. She picked up the coffee pot again and put it back on the stove and stood with her back to the Reverend for a moment. The word landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there like a coal-hot and specific and doing damage in a small, persistent way. She knew what it meant to have that word attached to your name. She knew what it did to a woman's reputation in a county where reputation was the only currency some women were allowed to hold. She turned around. Did he know she was making these calls? "I don't know. I don't believe so." "Does my father know?" "Not from me." She nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me all this." He looked at her with the particular worry of a man who has known a girl since she was small and has watched her grow into someone capable and proud, and now has to watch her get hit with something she hasn't deserved. "What will you do?" "I'm going to think about it," she said. "Clearly and practically the way I think about everything. And if the thinking leads somewhere difficult, then I'll handle the difficult thing," she said. "The same way I handle everything else." She thought about it all of Wednesday. She thought about it Thursday morning while she worked the garden, pulling it through the conversation in her mind, the way she'd pull a knot, slowly testing each thread, understanding which ones were load-bearing. The facts were, these Caroline Harrington believed she had a claim on Nathaniel Whitmore. Not a formal one, but a social one. The kind that in their world carried real weight. She was frightened of losing that claim. She was dealing with that fear the only way she knew how, which was to use the tools of social consequence with the efficiency and precision of someone who had been raised to understand exactly how much damage those tools could do. Elizabeth could not entirely blame her for this. She understood, had always understood, even on that first visit, that Caroline Harrington was not simply a villain. She was a woman whose whole position in the world was contingent on a marriage that had been informally promised and formally withheld, who was watching that position erode, and who was doing what frightened people with power do, striking preemptively. The question was what Elizabeth was going to do about it. She had 3 options as she saw it. She could say nothing and allow the talk to run its course, which would either resolve itself or do sufficient damage to her reputation that the whole situation resolved itself in the cruelest possible way. She could go to Whitmore directly and tell him what was being said, which felt both necessary and dangerous in ways she was still working through. Or she could go to Caroline herself. She had decided on the third option by Thursday afternoon, not because it was comfortable, because it was direct. And she had always believed that the most direct path to a problem was usually the shortest one, even when it was the steepest. She sent a note to Harrington House that evening. Caroline received her Friday morning. The Harrington parlor was everything Elizabeth had expected it to be. Large, well-appointed, designed to communicate station without appearing to try. Caroline was already seated when Elizabeth was shown in, which was a deliberate choice, and both women knew it. She looked composed and cool, and she watched Elizabeth sit down with the particular attention of a woman who is deciding in real time whether to maintain civility or dispense with it. "Miss Carter," she said, "I confess I'm surprised." "I imagine you are," Elizabeth said. "I'll be direct if you don't mind. I understand you've been making calls in the county." A pause. "I make calls regularly. It's a social obligation. The calls I'm referring to have a specific subject." Elizabeth held her gaze. "Me." Caroline's chin came up slightly. "People talk. I can't be responsible for what people discuss." "You can be responsible for what you tell them." A silence. Caroline leaned back in her chair slightly. She was reassessing. Elizabeth could see had been reassessing since Elizabeth walked in without nervousness. Caroline had expected nervousness. She hadn't prepared for the alternative. "What is it you want from this conversation?" Caroline asked. Her voice was still level, but the edges of it had sharpened. "I want to understand something," Elizabeth said. "You are clearly an intelligent woman. You know that speaking against my character in the county won't resolve your underlying concern because the underlying concern isn't about my character. It's about whether Nathaniel Whitmore makes a choice you don't control. And poisoning my name won't settle that. It will only make more people unhappy." Caroline looked at her for a long moment. "You are extraordinary," she said. It was not quite a compliment, and not quite an insult. It was the statement of a woman recalibrating. "I am practical," Elizabeth said, "which is different. You think you know what he needs. I think nobody owns another person's choices, including you, including me. He and I have an understanding. Then speak to him about it," Elizabeth said, and her voice was not unkind. "If there is an understanding, it deserves to be spoken plainly between the two of you in direct words. Not managed through other people's reputations. You are too intelligent for that, Miss Harrington. And so is he." Caroline was very still. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "to make my case directly to him. I'm telling you that you have a legitimate grievance, and you're spending it on the wrong target." Something moved behind Caroline's eyes. Something complicated and real. The slight, painful shift of a woman who had been expecting a fight and found instead that her opponent had handed her the sword and declined to pick up one for herself. "He won't choose me," Caroline said. The words came out quieter than anything she'd said so far. For a moment, she wasn't the polished daughter of a powerful family. She was a woman sitting in her own parlor, admitting something she'd known for longer than she'd allowed herself to acknowledge. Elizabeth looked at her with something she hadn't expected to feel genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry," she said. "For that, I am genuinely sorry. Because that is a real loss, and it matters." Caroline pressed her lips together, looked at the window, breathed. "The calls in the county," Elizabeth said carefully, "they'll stop." It wasn't a question. Caroline heard the difference. "They'll stop," Caroline said. Elizabeth stood. "Thank you for receiving me. Miss Carter?" Caroline's voice stopped her at the door. When Elizabeth turned, Caroline was looking at her with an expression that had moved several degrees from where it had started. Not warmth, not yet, but something that might in time become respect. "You would have been wasted on a small life." Elizabeth held her gaze. "So would you," she said. "Don't let them make you small either." She walked out. She told Nathaniel about it on Sunday. Not the whole of it. The essential shape that Mrs. Harrington had been making calls that Elizabeth had spoken to Caroline directly that the matter was settled as far as she could settle it. She told him plainly because she had decided he deserved plainness, and she watched his face while she told it. He went very still when she began. She could see the anger move through him, controlled, contained, but real. His jaw tightened. His hands, which had been easy on the porch railing, closed. "She had no right," he started. "She was frightened," Elizabeth said. "Frightened people often exceed their rights. That doesn't make it acceptable, but it makes it understandable." "Elizabeth, I handled it. That's what I'm telling you." She kept her voice even. "I'm not telling you so that you'll fight my battles. I'm telling you because you should know, and because I don't keep things from people I trust." That landed. He looked at her. "You trust me." "I am apparently developing that unfortunate habit, yes." His mouth moved. Not quite the startled smile from the garden. Something steadier than that. Something more like a man recognizing something he hadn't known he was looking for. "Caroline and I," he said. "There was never—" He stopped. Tried again. "Her mother and my mother were close. There was a mutual assumption years ago that was never formally stated because I was never willing to formally state it. I should have addressed it directly years before now. That's my fault." "It is?" Elizabeth agreed. He looked slightly surprised that she agreed. "It is your fault," she said, "and you can deal with it and it's done. People make messes and then they clean them up. That's the whole of it. You make it sound very simple. Most things are simpler than we make them when we decide to be honest about them." She looked at him. "What isn't simple in my experience is deciding to be honest." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll speak to Caroline," he said, "and to her mother. Directly, as you say. It should have been done long since." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "It should have." He nodded. Then, "You are the most consistently direct person I have ever met." "Is that a problem?" "It is the single most restful thing I have encountered in 10 years of dealing with people who say 5 things and mean a 6th. He looked at her with that steady, open quality that she had decided was the truest version of his face. "I didn't know people like you existed. In my world, in my experience, people don't say what they mean. They say what's advantageous. People say what they've been rewarded for saying," Elizabeth said. "I was never rewarded for saying anything other than the truth, so I never developed the habit of anything else." "Your father raised you well." "My mother raised me well," she said. "My father loved me well. They're different things." He considered this. "Yes," he said. "I suppose they are." He dealt with the Harrington situation that week as he'd promised. Elizabeth didn't know the specifics he didn't tell her, and she didn't ask, because she understood that some conversations belong to the people having them. But she saw Margaret Price at the general store on Wednesday, and Margaret pressed her hand and said quietly that she'd heard the Harrington business had been resolved, and that she was glad of it. "So am I," Elizabeth said. "He's a good man," Margaret said, carefully, watching Elizabeth's face. "Whatever you might have thought of him at first." "He is," Elizabeth said, just as carefully. Margaret Price smiled the smile of a woman who had been paying attention for many years and planned to continue doing so. The second Thursday of September, Nathaniel arrived later than usual and quieter than usual, and Elizabeth knew immediately that something had happened. She brought him coffee without asking. He took it and held the cup without drinking and sat on the porch steps rather than the chair, which was the choice of a man who needed to be lower to the ground somehow. She sat on the step above him and waited. "I went to Samuel's grave this morning," he said. "I haven't been since the funeral." She was still. "I talked to him," Nathaniel said, "which is probably, I don't know what that is, but I talked to him for a while." He stared at the drive. "I told him I was sorry, for the fight, for the things I said and the things I didn't say, for spending 4 years turning his death into a reason to stop being a person." Elizabeth didn't say anything. "He would have laughed at me," Nathaniel said, and his voice cracked on the last word just slightly, just enough. "That's what I kept thinking standing there. He would have laughed at me for being so damnably stubborn about it for so long. He would have said—" He stopped. His head dropped forward briefly. "He would have said I was being an idiot, and that he forgave me, and that I should, for the love of God, get on with living." Elizabeth reached down and put her hand over his where it rested on the step. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would be more useful than the simple weight of a hand. He didn't move, but she felt his hand turn slightly beneath hers, and his fingers close. They sat like that for a while in the early September air, and the farm moved around them, the distant sound of her father working, the ordinary noise of a day continuing, and neither of them spoke until Nathaniel said very quietly, I think I'd like to stop being a fortress now. Good, Elizabeth said. They're cold, and the upkeep is exhausting. He made a sound half-breath, half-laugh. I would like... He stopped. Started again. I would like to ask your father something, if you have no objection. Elizabeth looked at the side of his face. At the man she had watched across one extraordinary summer, slowly unbuild himself from something closed and defended into someone she could see clearly. She thought about the banknote. She thought about the East Field and the watermelons, and the note sent on Thursday, and the books about drainage. She thought about the way he said her name like it was a word he was still getting used to being allowed to say. She thought about what she wanted. I have no objection, she said. He turned and looked at her. His eyes were very serious and very open, and very much the eyes of a man who had spent 4 years looking at nothing and was now looking at something and was not entirely sure he deserved to. You should know, he said, that I am not. I am not a simple man to be with. I know that. I am still learning to be this. What this is. I cannot promise to be easy. I don't want easy, Elizabeth said. I've had easy. Easy is boring, and it breaks in bad weather. She looked at him steadily. I want honest. And I think you might be the most honest person I have met once you stopped hiding it. He stared at her. That is either the most unexpected compliment I have ever received, he said, or a challenge. It's both, she said. Most true things are. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he stood up. He straightened his coat. He picked up his hat. Is your father in the barn? He said. He's been in the barn for the last 2 hours doing very little actual work, Elizabeth said. He is, however, absolutely certain that he cannot be seen from the porch from that angle, so please don't tell him otherwise. Nathaniel Whitmore walked across the yard toward the barn, with the measured stride of a man going to do something that mattered and knew it. Elizabeth sat on the porch step and listened to the afternoon and felt something she had kept carefully budgeted for 3 years of hard practical living begin to open up cautiously, specifically, in the way of something that has been tightly closed and is now, for the first time in a long time, trying the light. She thought, careful. She thought, yes. She thought, this is what it feels like when something real begins. From the barn she heard her father's voice, surprised, and then warmer than surprised. She couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to. She looked out at the East Field, which was draining better than it had in years because someone had listened to what the land was trying to say. She thought sometimes people surprise you. She thought sometimes they earn it. Her father said yes, father. Elizabeth learned this not because Nathaniel told her directly, but because Thomas Carter came out of the barn 20 minutes after Nathaniel walked in, and his eyes were red at the corners, and he walked past her on the porch steps without saying a single word and went straight into the house. She heard him moving around the kitchen, heard the sound of the cabinet where he kept the good whiskey, the bottle he'd been saving since her mother's last birthday, the one he brought out for moments that required marking. She heard him pour one glass. Then she heard him pour a second. Nathaniel came out of the barn and looked at her across the yard. She looked back. He walked to the porch and stood at the bottom of the steps and said, he said yes. I know, Elizabeth said. He poured the good whiskey. Something crossed Nathaniel's face, warm and slightly undone, the face of a man who had braced for difficulty and received kindness instead, and didn't quite know what to do with the surplus of it. He cried, Nathaniel said. Just briefly. He turned away so I wouldn't see, but I saw. He does that, Elizabeth said. He cried at the county fair when I won the pie competition. He has very strong feelings about things that matter to him. The pie competition. I was 17. He talked about it for 6 months. Nathaniel looked at her with an expression she was still learning to name. It was warm, and it was careful, and it was the particular look of a man counting his unexpected good fortune and being slightly afraid of the counting. Elizabeth, he said, I want to be clear about something. I am not asking you to marry me because of the banknote or the East Field, or because it is practical. I want you to know that. She studied him. Then why, she asked, not a challenge. A genuine question asked the way she asked all genuine questions, directly, willing to hear the real answer. He was quiet for a moment. Because you are the first person in 4 years who looked at me and saw a man who needed to do better instead of a man who had the authority to decide he didn't have to. Because you said the true thing, even when it cost you. Because—" He stopped, started again more quietly. "Because Thursday became the day I measured the rest of the week against, and that is not a practical consideration. That is something else entirely." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." He blinked. "I haven't formally asked yet." "You asked," she said. "You just used more words than necessary." His mouth curved, full and real and unguarded. "Will you marry me, Elizabeth Carter?" "Yes," she said again. Same answer. From inside the house, her father knocked over something in the kitchen, recovered it loudly, and began to whistle in the exaggerated way of a man pretending he had not been standing near a window. They announced it quietly, and the county heard about it loudly, which was how things always worked in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business and treated that knowledge as a common resource. The reaction divided neatly along lines Elizabeth could have predicted without trying. Half the county was delighted Thomas Carter was well liked, his daughter was known as steady and capable, and Nathaniel Whitmore was respected and feared in roughly equal measure, so the combination was considered either a fine match or a fascinating development, depending on whom you asked. The other half was something else. She heard it in pieces, the way you hear rain before you see it, fragments from Margaret Price, a careful word from the dry goods owner's wife, a pointed silence from a woman at church who had been friendly the previous month and was notably less friendly now. The word opportunist did not reappear because Caroline Harrington had, as promised, stopped the calls. But the shape of the word was still there in some mouths worn smooth by use waiting. Elizabeth was not surprised. She was not undamaged by it either, but she had been expecting it, and there was a useful kind of armor in expectations. What she had not expected was Whitmore House. Jed. She had heard about it, of course. Everyone in the county had heard about Whitmore House. Nathaniel's estate sat 8 miles north of Carter Land on a rise above the river, 200 acres of homeland, a house that had been built by his grandfather and expanded twice since a staff of 12 formal gardens, a library that people spoke of in the same reverent tone usually reserved for churches. Nathaniel took her to see it on a Tuesday in late September, 3 weeks after the announcement. He rode beside her in his carriage, and she watched him become slightly tense as they approached, which was interesting and worth noting. He had been comfortable at her father's farm. Here he sat straighter, and his hands, which were usually easy, were not entirely easy. The house was large. She had known it would be large. Knowing it in the abstract and standing in front of it in the specific were somewhat different experiences. "It's very big," she said. "Yes," he said. "Were you happy here?" He thought about it seriously. "When Samuel was alive, before our father died, and I became responsible for all of it, before—" A pause. "It stopped being a home and became a management problem somewhere around my 28th year." "That's very sad," Elizabeth said plainly. "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at the house. She thought, this is a place where someone forgot to keep living, and then forgot they'd forgotten. She thought that can be fixed. She didn't say this yet. It wasn't the moment. But she put it in the column of things she knew alongside the drainage channel and the drainage project figures and every other practical truth she'd cataloged that summer. The staff received her in the formal entrance hall with the lined-up careful attention of people who were trying to determine a great deal from very little information very quickly. She read them the same way she read everything, their faces, their posture, the slight shifts that told her who was nervous, who was watching Nathaniel for cues, who was watching her independently. The housekeeper was a woman named Mrs. Adelaide Marsh, 60-ish, straight-backed, with the expression of someone who had managed this household through considerable turbulence and intended to continue doing so on her own terms. Elizabeth looked at her directly. "Mrs. Marsh," she said, "I imagine this is a great deal of change arriving at once." Mrs. Marsh's eyebrows moved slightly upward. "Mr. Whitmore has informed us of the engagement, miss." "Then you know as much as I do about what comes next," Elizabeth said. "I would very much like to learn how this house runs before I change anything about it. I've found that's generally the right order of operations." Mrs. Marsh looked at her. A long look. The look of a woman who had been braced for one kind of conversation and has received another. "That would be very sensible, miss," she said. "Good," Elizabeth said. "Perhaps you could show me the kitchen first. I always start with kitchens." Something shifted in Mrs. Marsh's expression. Just slightly, like a door opening a cautious inch. Nathaniel, walking slightly behind them, caught Elizabeth's eye. He gave her the look, the small, steady, warm look she'd been learning all summer, and she turned back to Mrs. Marsh and let herself be shown the kitchen. They were married in October. Not extravagantly, Elizabeth would not have permitted extravagance on principle. And Nathaniel had learned by then not to propose things she would not permit. The ceremony was at the county church attended by most of the county, which came partly out of affection and partly out of curiosity. And Elizabeth did not mind either reason because the result was the same. Her father walked her down the aisle and did not cry until they reached the front, at which point he cried openly and without apology, which was exactly like him and which Elizabeth loved him for. Nathaniel stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the careful blankness of that first dinner, not the measuring look, not even the warm, steady look she'd learned. Something new. Something that looked like a man watching the thing he had decided was worth being whole for walking toward him across a church floor and finding that the reality of it was larger than he'd known how to anticipate. She reached him. He took her hand. "You're here," he said, very quietly, like he hadn't entirely believed she would be. "I said I would be," she told him. "You did," he said. "You generally mean what you say." "Generally," she agreed. The Reverend began. Elizabeth held Nathaniel's hand and felt the particular quality of the moment, ordinary and extraordinary. Simultaneously, the way all the true hinge moments of a life feel like any other day and like nothing that has come before. She said yes when the moment required it. He said yes like a man who had rehearsed it and still found it larger than the rehearsal. The first weeks at Whitmore House were an education, not in the ways she'd expected. She'd expected the scale, the size of the house, the complexity of managing a staff of 12, the particular rhythms of an estate that had been running on its own, established patterns for decades. She'd prepared herself for all of that, and it was considerable, but it was the kind of considerable that yielded to attention and patience and her particular habit of learning systems from the inside before she altered them. What she hadn't prepared for was the texture of the loneliness that had been living in the house before she arrived. It wasn't dramatic loneliness. It didn't announce itself. It was in the small things, the dining room that was always set for one at the head of a table that seated 20, and the single place setting that had become so habitual that the staff had stopped seeing it. The library, which was magnificent and appeared to have been touched by no one in years. The music room shut up entirely, since some point Nathaniel didn't volunteer and she didn't press him on yet. The East Wing guest rooms that were clean and cold and had the feel of rooms that existed only to be maintained, not to be used. He had been here alone for 4 years. She had understood this in the abstract. She understood it differently now, in the specific room by room. On the third day, she asked Mrs. Marsh to open the music room. Mrs. Marsh looked at her. "Mr. Whitmore gave instructions." "I know," Elizabeth said. "Please open it anyway." A pause. "Shall I tell him you've asked?" "I'll tell him myself," Elizabeth said. "This evening." The music room opened. It smelled of closed space and old air, and there was a pianoforte against the far wall that had belonged, she would later learn, to Nathaniel's mother. She didn't play the instrument. She didn't do anything with the room that day, except stand in it for 10 minutes and let it stop being sealed. That evening, she told Nathaniel she'd opened it. He went still. "Elizabeth, it's a room," she said, not unkindly. It doesn't help Samuel to keep it shut. And it doesn't help you. A silence. My mother played, he said. Samuel played. I never learned. I always meant to ask him to teach me, and then there wasn't. He stopped. I know, she said. It felt like the last light closing. It meant I could. He stopped again. The sentence didn't seem to have an ending he wanted to arrive at, like if you kept everything still enough time would stop moving, and there would still be a before, Elizabeth said quietly. He looked at her. Yes, he said. Exactly like that. Time doesn't stop, she said. I know you know that, but the room doesn't have to mean what it's been meaning. Rooms mean what the living people in them decide they mean. He was quiet for a long time. Then, could you put flowers in it? She blinked. Flowers. My mother always had flowers. On the pianoforte. She said music needed to be near living things. He looked at his hands briefly. Could you put flowers in it? Elizabeth felt something in her chest go very still and very warm simultaneously. Yes, she said. I'll put flowers in it. He nodded. Once. Like a man accepting something he'd needed for longer than he'd known. Then, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday in November, everything changed. Elizabeth was in the library. She'd begun working through Nathaniel's estate accounts. Not because he'd asked, but because she'd noticed they were organized in a way that made tracking expenditures across multiple holdings unnecessarily complicated, and she couldn't look at an inefficient system without wanting to improve it. Mrs. Marsh had accepted this with the slightly stunned approval of a woman who had not previously had anyone in the house who cared about accounts. She was 3 hours into a 6-year revenue comparison when she found the discrepancy. It was in the mill holdings. She almost missed it. It was the kind of thing that looked like a clerical error on first reading, the kind of small inconsistency that a busy man managing a large operation might overlook. A payment recorded in the ledger as disbursed to a land maintenance firm dated 2 years prior for an amount that was substantial but not extraordinary. She looked at it. She looked at the corresponding entry in the revenue column. Then she went back through the previous year's records. Then the year before that. The discrepancy wasn't a clerical error. It was a pattern. Payments flowing out to a land maintenance firm named Hartwell and Associates, recorded in the accounts every 8 to 11 months in amounts that varied just enough to avoid forming an obvious sequence. Elizabeth got up and found the contract files and looked for a Hartwell and Associates engagement, and found nothing. She looked for the firm in the county records she'd asked Mrs. Marsh to locate for her the previous week, and found nothing there either. She sat at the library desk for a long time. Then she went to find her husband. He was in the East Fields with his property manager, a man named Gideon Cole, who had been with the estate for 11 years, and whom Nathaniel trusted the way you trust someone who has been reliable so long, you stop thinking to verify it. Elizabeth waited until Cole had walked away before she spoke. Nathaniel, I need to show you something in the library. He read her face immediately. What's happened? Nothing certain yet. Come look. She showed him the records the way she showed him everything clearly in sequence with the math laid out plainly. Payment here. No corresponding service contract. Same pattern 7 times across 3 years. She put the numbers in order on the desk where he could see them. He read them. His face went very still. Not the old stillness, not the blankness. This was different. This was the stillness of a man who has just understood something he did not want to understand. How much? He said. His voice was flat. Total. She had calculated it. Across the 3 years I have records for $12,000, possibly more in prior years. His jaw tightened. Cole has managed these accounts. Yes. He has managed them for 11 years. Yes. He stood very still for another moment. She watched him work through it, the betrayal of it, the specific arithmetic of 11 years of trust being revised in a single afternoon. You're certain? I am not infallible, she said carefully. But yes, I'm certain. He nodded once, slow and precise like a man establishing his footing on changed ground. I need to speak with Cole, he said. Not alone, Elizabeth said. He looked at her. Not alone, she said again. Take your attorney. This is not a conversation for one man without a witness. A pause. You think he'll deny it? I think denial is likely yes. And I think a man who has been taking money from you for 3 years has had time to prepare for the conversation you're about to have with him. You need a witness. You need everything said out loud and in the presence of someone who can attest to it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, You found this in 3 hours. The accounts weren't organized to be found, she said. But they weren't organized to be hidden from someone who knew to look either. He probably assumed no one would look. It's an easy assumption to make when you have been trusted completely and have given no visible reason to doubt. 11 years, Nathaniel said very quietly. I know. He came to Samuel's funeral. He stood beside me. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would lessen that particular weight. Nathaniel straightened. His face settled into something that was hard and clear, and without the old blankness grief, yes, but grief with direction, which is a very different thing. I'll send for Alderman Davies today, he said. Davies was his attorney based in Richmond. We'll meet with Cole tomorrow. I'll write up the accounting in a form Davies can work from tonight, Elizabeth said. Organized by date amount and the absence of corresponding contracts. He'll need it in plain language, not ledger format. Nathaniel looked at her. You don't have to. I'm already doing it, she said. Go send the message to Davies. He crossed the library to the door. He stopped. Elizabeth. She looked up from the desk, where she'd already begun pulling records. If you hadn't looked at those accounts... He stopped. He could have continued for years more. Probably, she said. You didn't have to look. I didn't ask you to. No, she said. But someone who loves this estate looks after it. And I love this estate. She had not said the word before. Not directly. It landed in the room between them, and they both felt where it landed. Nathaniel stood in the doorway and looked at her across the library, that smelled of old paper, and the flowers she'd put on every surface, because she'd decided this house needed to feel like the living occupied it. Elizabeth, he said. His voice was different. Quieter and fuller simultaneously, the voice of a man who has just been handed something that costs the giver nothing to give, and yet is the most valuable thing they own. The letter, she said, because if she didn't move, she was going to do something undignified like cry over a set of account books. Write the letter to Davies. We have work to do. He smiled, real and full and unguarded. He wrote the letter. The meeting with Gideon Cole happened the next afternoon in the library with Alderman Davies present, and Elizabeth sitting to one side with the organized accounting she'd spent the previous evening preparing. Cole denied it first. Of course he did. He was good at it, smooth and practiced and genuinely confused seeming, which was the performance of a man who had probably run the denial in his mind many times. He had explanations. The payments were for services rendered outside the formal contract structure. He had verbal authorizations. The records were incomplete due to a fire in his own office files 2 years prior. Convenient that. Elizabeth said nothing during the denial. She let him finish. She let him build his structure. Then she opened the folder she'd prepared and placed it on the desk in front of Davies. 7 payments, she said. Dates, amounts, payees. Cross-referenced against all service contracts held by the estate for the corresponding periods. I have also obtained the county business register. She produced this. Hartwell & Associates is not registered as a business in this county or in Richmond. I sent inquiries to 3 neighboring counties this morning. No registration in those either. Cole's face changed. She continued. The payment amounts taken in sequence match no standard maintenance service pricing I have found in any comparable estate accounting I have been able to examine for reference. They do, however, match in timing and approximate amount the personal debt schedule of a particular individual, which I am prepared to document if required. Dead silence. Davies looked at the folder, then at Cole. Mr. Cole, he said, I think you'd better start again with the truth this time. Cole started again. It took 2 hours. The full scope of it was worse than Elizabeth's numbers had shown. He'd been doing it for 7 years, not 3. But the earlier records were in a format that had obscured the pattern. The total, when Davies had finished with the accounting, was closer to $30,000. Nathaniel sat through all of it without saying a single unnecessary word. Elizabeth watched him and understood the quality of his silence, not the old empty silence, but the silence of a man who has decided not to speak until he knows exactly what he wants to say. When it was done, and Cole had been removed to the care of the county constable, Nathaniel sat in the library for a long time without moving. Elizabeth let him sit. Eventually he said, $30,000. Yes. 7 years. Yes. While I was closed off and grieving and not looking at anything. His voice was even, but she could hear what was under the even. He knew I wasn't looking. Yes, she said. He did. I let that happen. You didn't know. I should have. Nathaniel. She waited until he looked at her. A man who deceives you for 7 years carries the weight of that deception, not the man who trusted him. There is a difference between trusting someone and being foolish. You trusted someone who had earned 11 years of reliable service before he began stealing. That is not the same as being careless. A pause. You found it. That's what matters now. You found it, he said. We found it, she said firmly. You married someone who looks at accounts. That was an excellent decision on your part. Something broke open in his face. Not laughter, not quite, but the particular expression of a man who has been through a very dark afternoon and has just been unexpectedly handed a handhold. It was, he said. It was a genuinely excellent decision. Yes, Elizabeth said. I'm glad we agree. She reached across the desk and turned the next page of the accounting file to the action items she'd already drafted, the legal steps Davies would need to take, the estate accounts that required immediate restructuring, the holdings that would need review. Because that was who she was. She found the wound, she named it clearly, and then she picked up the tools and started the repair. Nathaniel watched her and thought, this is what it feels like when someone stays. Not because they have to, because they choose to every morning with their whole capable and honest heart. And he understood, sitting in the library of the house that had been a fortress for 4 years, that Elizabeth Carter had not married into Whitmore Estate. Whitmore Estate had been saved by her. The Cole case went to the county court in November. Davies managed the legal proceedings with the methodical efficiency of a man who had been handed an unusually well-organized set of evidence and intended to use every page of it. Elizabeth's accounting, the 7 years of cross-referenced payments, the missing business registrations, the debt schedule she'd traced back to Cole's personal finances, became the foundation of the prosecution's case. Davies told Nathaniel it was the cleanest fraud documentation he had seen in 20 years of practice. Nathaniel told Elizabeth this over supper one evening in the second week of November. She looked up from her plate. What did you tell him? I told him my wife kept the accounts. And he said he hoped I understood what I had. Nathaniel looked at her steadily. I told him I was beginning to. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to her supper because she had never known how to receive a compliment without immediately needing something to do with her hands. But she was smiling. He could see it in the corner of her mouth. He was learning to read those corners. Cole's guilt was established by the court before December. The judgment required repayment of the documented amount, the seizure of Cole's personal property toward that debt, and a formal censure that effectively ended his ability to work in estate management in the county. Davies said the outcome was as strong as could be expected, and that full repayment was unlikely given Cole's personal assets, but that the legal record stood and would stand. Nathaniel listened to all of this in Davies' office, and then came home and found Elizabeth in the library reorganizing the estate filing system she had rebuilt from scratch over the previous 6 weeks. She had the files spread across the reading table in a pattern that made no sense until you understood it, At which point it made total sense, which was exactly how her mind worked. "It's done," he said. She looked up. "Cole," she said. "Guilty. Judgment for repayment and censure." She nodded once. Clean and complete. The way she accepted outcomes, she'd done everything possible to determine not triumph, just closure. "Good," she said. "Davies sends his compliments to your accounting." "Davies can send them to the accounting directly. It doesn't need me as an intermediary." She turned back to the files. "How are you?" He considered the question seriously because she always meant it seriously, and he had learned not to answer it casually. "Relieved," he said, and angry still underneath the relief. "I think the anger will take longer." "That's honest," she said. "I'm practicing," he said. She looked at him over the top of the filing spread. There was something in her face that was warm and amused, and deeply specifically fond, the look of a woman who finds a particular person's particular way of being in the world genuinely pleasing, and has stopped pretending otherwise. "You're getting better at it," she said. "I had a good teacher," he said. December came in cold and bright, and with it came the county's annual winter gathering at the Morrison estate, the largest social occasion of the season, attended by everyone who was anyone in the county, and a great many people who weren't, but showed up anyway, because the Morrisons served excellent food, and the occasion gave people something to dress for. Elizabeth had not attended a social gathering as Nathaniel Whitmore's wife before this one. She understood what it was going to be. She was not naive about it. She had grown up in this county, and she knew the particular combination of warmth and assessment that accompanied a new wife's first public appearance, especially a wife who had arrived with a story already attached to her, the farmer's daughter, the dinner table confrontation, the swift engagement that had surprised everyone and pleased no one who had expected a different match. She understood all of this, and she dressed carefully, and she let Mrs. Marsh fuss over her hair for approximately 4 minutes before she called it sufficient. "You look very well, ma'am," Mrs. Marsh said. "Mrs. Marsh," Elizabeth said, "you have been in this household for 15 years. You can tell me the truth." A pause. Then, with the faint precision of a woman who had decided to commit, "You look exceptionally well, ma'am," Elizabeth looked at herself in the glass. The dress was a deep blue. Nathaniel had asked quietly 3 weeks prior whether she had something for winter occasions, and when she'd told him the truth, which was that she had 2 dresses that qualified, and neither of them fit the Whitmore estate scale of winter occasion, he'd arranged for a dressmaker from Richmond without making a production of it. The dress was the best thing she had owned in her life, and she had accepted it without guilt, because guilt over necessities was something she'd decided she was done with. She looked like herself, just more resourced. "Good enough," she said. "Let's go." The Morrison house was full when they arrived. She felt the room change when they walked in, not dramatically, not in a way anyone would admit to if asked, but in the small collective adjustment of a room that has registered a new variable and is running its calculations. She had expected this. She had not entirely expected the calculations to resolve so quickly in her favor. It started with Margaret Price, who came forward immediately and warmly and said something kind about the blue of the dress, which was Margaret, being Margaret loyal and acute in equal measure. But then James Morrison himself, their host, came over and shook Nathaniel's hand, and looked at Elizabeth with the frank, assessing approval of a man who had heard the account story from 3 different people and had decided the woman who reorganized a fraud case documentation in a single evening was someone worth knowing. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I understand we have your eye for accounts to thank for the coal business. We have an inadequate filing system and too much free time to thank for it," Elizabeth said. "The eye just noticed." Morrison laughed, a real laugh, the kind that opens a room up. "I like this woman," he said to Nathaniel, as though Nathaniel had produced her. "So do I," Nathaniel said, with the easy certainty of a man who no longer needed to qualify that statement. After that, the room recalibrated. Not everyone. There were still women near the far window who watched her with the particular careful attention of people who had decided their assessment was not yet final. There was a group near the fireplace where she could feel the subject matter change as she approached. She did not take any of this personally because she had grown up in a county and understood that a county takes time, and time was something she had. But the room on balance moved toward her, and she understood why in a way she wouldn't have predicted 3 months ago. She had not tried to perform anything. She had not tried to seem like she belonged in these rooms. She simply moved through them the way she moved through everything, with the specific gravity of a person who knows what she thinks and has decided her own opinion of a thing is the relevant starting point. People could feel that. Even people who weren't sure they approved of it could feel it. She found herself near the window later in the evening talking with a woman named Ruth Aldridge, 50 sharp, with the kind of intelligence that had never quite found its appropriate outlet in the social world it was born into. They had discovered somewhere in the middle of a conversation about winter crop management that neither of them had expected to find interesting, that they agreed on 4 things and disagreed productively on a 5th, and that this was more intellectual engagement than either of them had gotten out of a social occasion in recent memory. "You should have been a solicitor," Ruth Aldridge said, with a kind of frank admiration that had no performance in it. "I should have been several things that women aren't permitted to be," Elizabeth said. "I content myself with being all of them informally." Ruth Aldridge laughed. "Where were you 10 years ago? I have been boring myself at these gatherings since 1806. I was at my father's farm," Elizabeth said, counting money that wasn't there, and hoping the math would change if I looked at it long enough. "Does it?" "Never," Elizabeth said. "But the looking teaches you things the money doesn't." Ruth Aldridge pressed her hand when they parted. "Come call on me," she said. "Come any Tuesday. My husband won't be there on Tuesdays, and we can say whatever we actually think." Elizabeth smiled. "I'll bring the good coffee," she said. It was on the way home from the Morrison gathering that the last piece of unfinished business announced itself. They were in the carriage an hour into a quiet ride when Nathaniel said, "Caroline was there tonight." Elizabeth had seen her, across the room once. Caroline had been with her mother and a man Elizabeth didn't recognize, someone from Richmond she'd gathered from snippets of conversation. She'd looked composed and distant and had not come near Elizabeth all evening, which had been a mutual and probably wise decision. "I know," Elizabeth said. "She looked well," Nathaniel said carefully. "She did." A pause. "I owe her a proper conversation. Not the one we had when I withdrew that was necessary, but it was also brief, and I was not as considerate as I could have been." He was quiet for a moment. "I treated the whole business like a problem to be resolved, rather than a person to be respected. That was wrong of me." Elizabeth looked at him in the dark of the carriage. "Yes," she said. "It was." He accepted this without flinching, because he had gotten considerably better at accepting the plain truth. "I'll call on the Harringtons this week, properly, just to close it with dignity." "She deserves that," Elizabeth said. "She does." A beat. "You knew about the Richmond man," Elizabeth said. It wasn't quite a question. "Davies mentioned it. He knows the family. Apparently the acquaintance has been progressing since September." Nathaniel paused. "I hope it goes well for her." "So do I," Elizabeth said. And meant it. She had meant it since that morning in the Harrington parlor, when she'd looked at Caroline and seen not an obstacle, but a woman trying to protect the only future she believed she had. She hoped Caroline found a better one. The conversation with the Harringtons happened that Thursday. Nathaniel came home quieter than usual, and Elizabeth gave him the space of supper and the first hour after before she asked. "How was it?" "Difficult," he said. "And right. Both things." He was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Harrington said something surprising. "What?" she said. He paused, seemed to be deciding how to say it. "She said that whatever she thought of the manner of it, she believed I had made the right choice. She said that the kind of woman who walks into a man's house and finds a 7-year fraud in an afternoon is the kind of woman an estate like Whitmore needs." His mouth curved slightly. She said she meant it as a compliment. Elizabeth thought about Mrs. Harrington, that particular cold, kind manner, The woman who delivered truths in February voices, and thought that yes, coming from her, that probably was a compliment. "What did you say?" Elizabeth asked. "I said I agreed." He looked at her, and that the estate was the least of what she'd found. The fire crackled. The library was warm. The flowers on the pianoforte in the next room were the third arrangement Elizabeth had put there since October. She looked at her husband and thought about a summer dinner and a glass set down and words spoken into a room that had gone silent, and how the distance between that moment and this one was the whole length of a life changing. "That's the nicest thing you've said to me," she told him. "It won't be the last," he said. January brought a harder cold than the county had seen in years, and with it came the first genuine test of everything Elizabeth had been building since October. The test arrived in the form of the tenant families on Whitmore's eastern holdings, 6 families who had been farming parcels of Whitmore land for between 3 and 12 years, living in housing that Cole had been responsible for maintaining, and had it emerged, been consistently underfunding for the past 4 years while recording full maintenance disbursements in the accounts. The money had gone like so much else to Hartwell and Associates. Elizabeth found this in the restructured accounts on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of January. By Tuesday afternoon, she had ridden out to the Eastern Holdings herself with Mrs. Marsh's youngest nephew as escort because Nathaniel was in Richmond for 2 days and she was not prepared to wait. What she found was not a crisis, not yet, but it was the shape of one visible to anyone willing to look. Roofs that had not been properly repaired. Firewood stores that were lower than they should have been for this depth of winter. A well on the Harding family parcel that had been showing problems since September and had never been addressed despite 2 written requests to Cole that Elizabeth found in the tenant files when she returned. She got back to the house at dusk and wrote 4 letters before supper. 1 to the county's best carpenter. 1 to the woodsman who supplied the estate's own fuel. 1 to the well digger in the southern county. And 1 to each of the 6 tenant families direct plain signed with her own name, telling them that the failures of maintenance they had experienced were being addressed, that the repairs would begin within the week, and that she was sorry it had taken this long. She signed them Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore. She had not used the name formally before. It felt different on paper than she'd expected. Not smaller than her own name. Not larger. Just true. The way things felt when they were right. Nathaniel came home from Richmond to find the carpenter already on the Eastern Holdings and a bill of works on the library desk. He read through it. He came to find her in the kitchen where she was talking through the wood fuel delivery schedule with the housekeeper's assistant, a young woman named Patsy, who had recently revealed an unexpected talent for logistics. He waited until Patsy had gone. "You rode out there alone," he said. "Not an accusation, a statement being processed." "With an escort," she said. "Elizabeth?" "Cole left those families without adequate maintenance for 4 years," she said. "In the accounts I'm responsible for on land you own in January. What would you have had me do? Wait 2 days?" He looked at her. Then he said, "No, you're right." "I know I'm right," she said, but not unkindly. "I would have told you first if you'd been here. Since you weren't, I handled it. That is what a wife does when she has half a brain and the authority to act." "You have considerably more than half a brain." "Yes," she said. "So let me use it." He held her gaze for a long moment. "The Harding well," he said. "They'd submitted requests to Cole. Twice, documented. I have the letters." He ignored them. "Yes, for 4 months, in autumn going into winter." His voice was very even. "A family with 3 young children and a failing well." "Yes," Elizabeth said. He was quiet. "I want to go out there," he said, "personally, to each family." She looked at him. This was new, not the decision itself, but the instinct behind it. The Nathaniel Whitmore of 6 months ago had managed his holdings at distance through intermediaries, with the efficiency of a man administering a business rather than a man connected to the human weight of it. This Nathaniel, the one standing in her kitchen, wanting to go personally to a family whose well he hadn't known was failing, was a different man. A better one. "Saturday," she said. "I'll come with you." "Yes," he said. "I'd like that." They went on Saturday, all 6 families. Starting with the Hardings, because the well was the most urgent, and because Nathaniel had decided that the most urgent thing was where you started, which was a principle Elizabeth had always operated by, and was glad to find he'd arrived at independently. She watched him with those families, watched him do something she had seen him struggle toward across an entire summer and autumn, the simple human act of being present with people whose lives he affected without the distance of authority or the armor of indifference. He listened to their concerns the way he'd learned to listen to her. He asked questions that showed he'd understood the previous answer. He did not make promises he couldn't keep. He made the ones he could, plainly and specifically, and she knew he would keep them, because she knew him now, the actual texture of who he was, and this was a man who kept his word. The Harding children were everywhere underfoot. There were 3 of them, 6'4" and a toddler of approximately 2, who had decided Nathaniel's coat buttons were the most interesting objects she had ever encountered, and communicated this by grabbing them repeatedly. Nathaniel, who had spent 4 years in a closed-up house with no children and no warmth and very little of anything that wasn't purposeful, looked briefly startled by this small person and her opinions about his buttons. Then he crouched down to her level. "Those are brass," he told her with perfect seriousness. "From a maker in Philadelphia." The child stared at him and grabbed another button. "I'll take that as approval," he said. Elizabeth, standing 6 feet away, felt something in her chest. Do something she was not going to be dignified about if she stayed looking at it, so she turned and spoke to Mrs. Harding about the well repair schedule and kept her voice very steady and her eyes very dry. It was a near thing. The second twist came in February, and it came from a direction nobody had seen. A letter arrived from Richmond, addressed to Nathaniel from a firm of attorneys Elizabeth didn't recognize. She brought it to him in the library and watched his face as he read it. His face did something complicated. "What is it?" she said. He handed her the letter without speaking. She read it. It was from the estate of a man named Arthur Whitmore, Nathaniel's father's younger brother, a man who had left Virginia when Nathaniel was a child and built a separate business in Richmond and Baltimore, and apparently accumulated a considerable estate of his own. Arthur Whitmore had died in December with no direct heirs. And Arthur Whitmore, according to his attorneys, had left the bulk of his estate, including a Baltimore shipping interest, 2 Richmond properties, and a sum Elizabeth calculated quickly and then recalculated because the number didn't look real to his nephew Nathaniel. And in the letter accompanying the legal notification, there was a personal note. Nathaniel handed her this separately after a moment. She read it. Arthur Whitmore had written it 2 months before he died, in the knowledge that he was dying. He had written about watching Nathaniel from a distance, through business acquaintances, through county reports, through the kind of watching a man does when he has removed himself from a family, but not from caring about it. He had written about Samuel. He wrote that he had grieved Samuel quietly and alone, because he had not felt he had the right to grieve publicly, having been absent so long. He wrote about hearing through those same distant channels that Nathaniel had recently married, that the woman he'd married had the county talking, and not always kindly, but that the story he'd heard about a farmer's daughter who'd told America's most powerful landowner the truth at a dinner table and changed his life in the process was the kind of story that made an old man believe something was still working right in the world. He wrote, "I do not know your wife, but I know what it costs a proud man to become the person someone else believes he could be. Whatever she gave you to do that Nathaniel, it was not a small thing. Do not let her forget that she changed the shape of you." Elizabeth read this twice. She set the letter down on the desk. She breathed carefully through her nose. "I didn't know about Arthur," Nathaniel said. "I mean, I knew he existed. He and my father had a disagreement before I was born. I was never told the full nature of it. He was just absent. A name." "He wasn't absent," Elizabeth said quietly. "He was watching." "Yes, Nathaniel looked at the letter. From a distance. The way I was everywhere for 4 years. Watching from distance so nothing could reach me. She looked at him. He came back at least, Nathaniel said. At the end, he put it in writing. So did you, Elizabeth said. You came back to my father's house at 9:30 on a Thursday with your hat in your hands and said what needed to be said. That was you coming back. He was very still. Elizabeth, he said, I need to tell you something. She waited. I came back that night, he said. Not only because I felt guilty about your father. I came back because I could not stop thinking about you. About the way you looked at me across that table and said the true thing without calculation, without protection. You just said it. He stopped, collected himself. I have been thinking about you in some form or another since that night every day, and I want you to know that. Because Arthur's letter says not to let you forget that you changed the shape of me. And I don't want to forget to tell you that it was not the shape of my estate, or my accounts, or my management practices. It was me. You changed me, and I am grateful for it every single morning. The room was very quiet. Elizabeth looked at her husband, this man who had been a fortress and had decided for her to become a home, and felt the full weight of the year land somewhere deep and permanent. I know, she said. I've been watching. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Of course you have. It's my best quality, she said, and my worst one. He stood up and crossed the library and put his hands on either side of her face with the careful, specific tenderness of a man who knows what he has and does not intend to be careless with it. It is your best quality, he said. Entirely. She put her hands over his. Arthur was right, she said quietly. Don't let me forget either. Never, he said. Not for a single day. Spring came back to Virginia in March, the way spring always comes gradually, and then all at once, turning the fields from the gray of hard winter to the particular green that makes you remember why anyone ever chose to stay in a difficult place and work it honestly. Thomas Carter came to Whitmore Estate for Sunday supper most weeks now. He had color in his face that hadn't been there in years. The East Field was draining properly. The banknote had been settled. He had, in the way of men who have been relieved of a weight they carried so long, they'd forgotten what upright felt like slowly been becoming himself again, or a new version of himself, the one on the other side of the worst years, which was lighter and more grateful and inclined to laugh at things he would once have been too tired to find funny. He and Nathaniel had developed a friendship that Elizabeth watched with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had caused two people to be in the same room, and watches them decide they like each other on their own terms. They argued about tobacco prices and crop rotation and the county road situation. Her father told Nathaniel the pie competition story 3 times, and Nathaniel listened to it with genuine attention all 3 times, which was how Elizabeth knew he was a fundamentally good man. The last piece came in April. The County Agricultural Society held its spring meeting, and James Morrison proposed Elizabeth Whitmore as an advisor to the Society's Accounts Committee, the first woman to hold any formal advisory role in the organization's history. He proposed it, he said publicly, on the grounds that she had demonstrated in the coal case and in the restructuring of the Whitmore estate accounts a level of financial clarity that the Society could use and had previously been unable to find. There was discussion. Some of it was comfortable, and some of it wasn't. Elizabeth was not present for the meeting. She was at home in the library working on the spring planting figures. Nathaniel came home that evening and told her. She was quiet for a moment. That's unexpected, she said. Morrison is a straightforward man, Nathaniel said. He sees something useful and he says so. Most men don't consider women useful in that capacity. Most men haven't watched you find a 7-year fraud in 3 hours. He sat down across from her. Will you accept? She thought about it. The farmer's daughter who had spent 3 years counting money that wasn't there. The woman who had sat at this desk and cross-referenced ledger entries by candlelight until the pattern emerged. The woman who had been called an opportunist by people who didn't understand the difference between seizing an opportunity and building something worth having. "Yes," she said, "I'll accept." Nathaniel looked at her with the open, specific, unguarded look she had come to understand was the truest version of his face. "Good," he said. "It'll cause talk," she said. "Let it," he said. "Talk is how things change." She looked at him. She thought about a dinner table in the summer of 1816. A glass set down. Words spoken into silence. A man who had turned for the first time that evening and actually seen her. She thought about everything that had followed the Thursday mornings, and the East Field, and the books about drainage and the music room flowers, and the library in winter, and a child grabbing brass buttons, and a dead man's letter that said, "You changed the shape of him." She thought about what it meant to speak the true thing even when it costs you. What it meant to look at a closed-up man and see not what he was, but what he was capable of, and then to hold that version up steadily until he could see it himself. She thought, this is what I built, not from nothing, from truth spoken plainly into a room that wasn't ready for it. And she understood completely and without doubt that the woman they had once called insignificant had not married into power. She had walked into a summer evening with her whole honest self and built something better. That was not luck. That was not a story about a woman who was rescued. That was a woman who looked at the world, clearly said what was true, and made the life she deserved, and in doing so, gave the man beside her the chance to become the person he was always meant to be. That was Elizabeth Carter Whitmore. And she was in every room she walked into for the rest of her life the strongest person in it.